The Acts of the Apostles, then, are the things that they did after the death and what happened to them, and is thought to be the most historical. After that, then, you get into some things that are completely different than we might be looking at, or you might think would be in the New Testament. When you get to the letter to the Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians, Thessalonians, those are letters that are attributed to Saul, who becomes Paul. And I have given you an overview for that, to look into who Saul was, who Paul is. And this is very different from the ministry group that you had at the time of Jesus. Paul was not one of the disciples, was not part of the 3-year ministry, did not know Jesus alive except for the on the road to Damascus when he gets the bright light. This is a different individual talking about Jesus, who really is coming from this striking conversion experience, the theophany meaning an experience or a seeing of God, sees Jesus on the road, and then Paul begins to set up little churches. These letters are the responses of Paul to these small churches. Unfortunately, with Paul's life, we don't have the letters that the original church wrote to Paul. For example, the letter to the Romans is to a small church at Rome that Paul has established. We can find out what might be happening in the church at Rome by the answers that Paul gives in the narrative. Sometimes he is talking about general theology, things of God, ways to deal with being a person of Jesus. Other times he's answering specific problems, questions that the churches have. We have none of the church's letters, but the churches, fortunately, kept the letters that Paul wrote back. So as you're doing a geographic study in a map study, it's always good to begin to familiarize yourself with the geographic distances here. Rome, Corinth, Galatia, Philippians, Colossians, Thessalonians, part of these are cities and part of them are areas. Like you might say Ohio is the Buckeye State, but Columbus is the capital. So there would be a difference in an area as opposed to a specific city. Corinthians, there's a church at Corinth. You have 2 letters that exist in some form. I'm not saying we have the original letters, but at least we have copies of Paul's response to the church at Corinth. In that, then, you get Paul's understanding of how Christianity should go, to the reactions and the difficulties and the joys that the people at Corinth might have had. Galatians is a specific area rather than a city. So the church at Galatia will be one of those places in Asia Minor that you might find on the map today in modern Turkey. Ephesus is a city in Turkey, and if you take a cruise in the Mediterranean, often it will stop at Ephesus. So the Ephesians is to the people who are of the church at Ephesus. Philippi is a city. Colossians, Colossia, Thessalonians, then to the people at Thessalonica. You see there then, in one sense, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the stories of Jesus. The Acts of the Apostles are what happened with them and to them and with Saul Paul as sort of a transitional and semi or quasi-historical document. After that, much of the New Testament is Paul's theology, Paul's point of view, and Paul's trying to work with these new churches. And so rather than the whole Greek New Testament being the stories of Jesus, when you look at the table of contents, you see that that's just not the case. Then you have Paul's letters to Timothy, Titus, Philemon, and to others who happen to be persons who are working with, or persons that Paul has sent back to work with a church or to establish a church in another geographic area. All the time when you get to the Revelations, that's one of the apocalyptic writings. It's given oftentimes to another writer, but is end times material rather than the writings of Paul. See then that the outline of what we look at as the Greek New Testament is very little of Jesus alive and ministering, and much about the early church as it relates to the Jerusalem people, those 11 plus the one more, that would be the original apostles or disciples. Please know that also there are other people that wouldn't be listed by name that were disciples, apostles. There would be women and others that weren't part of the original 12 who would be doing the work. But you have the Jerusalem church, and then you have Paul, and Paul is not going to do his work in Galilee or Judah, Israel, or in Jerusalem, but in other geographic areas, mostly in what would be the rest of the Mediterranean area of the Roman Empire. Look at maps. I won't have you do a huge big map for this, but as you do scripture studies from now on, you'll find that it's really neat to have a sense. Where is Ephesus? Where is Corinth? Where was Rome? Where is Rome if it exists today? And then, as you hear current events or the news, you can correlate some of these places with places where Paul had churches. Lots of these places today will be heavily Muslim rather than Christian. But this is where Christianity started and was very successful, rather than Christianity being extremely successful in the Promised Land. If Jews had recognized Jesus of Nazareth as the Messiah, then it probably would have stayed in the same religion. They would have been Jewish Christians. Maybe they wouldn't even have called themselves Christians, but they would have been Jews after the coming of the Messiah. But Jesus of Nazareth didn't fulfill so many of the things that Jews were looking for. They wanted an earthly king. We look back to the Saul, king of the Old Testament times, Hebrew Bible, Saul, David, Solomon. They wanted an earthly king, and basically they wanted to throw the bums out. And the bums at the time of Jesus are the Romans. The Romans are the ones who are running the show. They're the ones that have taken over the Promised Land. And in a long series of events that started with the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, and many others, after the Greeks, you get to the Romans. They want the Promised Land as a nation back in the hands of the Jews. Jesus was not that kind of a military leader, did not come so much to establish that earthly throne, and certainly wasn't the type of person, I don't think, that would have sat on it, and was not the type of Messiah they were looking for. So that is the reason that many Jews never saw in Jesus what persons who see him to be an extraordinary and to be the basis or foundation of faith would see. As you look at the Greek New Testament, then continue to ask, is this during the time of Jesus? Is this after the death? Is this in the later ministry? And geographically and historically, how does this fit together? How late is it? Because those things will give you a background as to the culture and experience of the people that the letters were written for, that Mark, Matthew, and Luke have who they wrote for, what audience they were trying to get to, and therefore the different stories that are included, the things that Jesus said that are included, and those that are not included. It's about 65 degrees in northern Ohio today, slightly hazy, but it is coming to spring. Our flag irises are up this much, and the mini daffodils are out in flower. We had an awful winter, so we are all thrilled for it to be spring now. Have a blessed day, and the rest of Lent, may it bring to you joy and peace as we go towards Easter. Let it be so.